Hello, everybody. I am Diana Mackay with the Institute for Global Health and Development at Aga Khan University. We have a lot to discuss during this webinar entitled Achieving the SDGs, Has COVID-19 Made This Impossible? And we don't want to waste a minute, so I will get us started. First, a reminder that the session is being recorded. We will make the recording available on our Institute's website, which is www.aku.edu/IGHD, which I will post in the chat as the link momentarily. Second, we have many people participating, and so we've enabled some of the features on Zoom that facilitate your involvement. First, please make use of the chat function. I encourage you to introduce yourself by name and organization. Please be sure to note that you can use the drop-down menu in the chat box to send your comments either to all panelists or to all participants. So please do share your comments with all participants so that everybody can see your contributions. And feel free to engage in the chat during the course of the webinar as well. Second, please make use of the question and answer function to pose questions that our moderators and speakers might want to address in the discussion following the opening presentations and remarks. We'll do our best to address them during the webinar or by follow-up afterwards. Finally, following the webinar, you are always welcome to communicate with us at the Institute for Global Health and Development by email, and I will post my email in the chat to enable that. Finally, this webinar is accredited by the Accreditation Council for Continuing Medical Education, and for those requesting it, an e-certificate can be provided after the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to turn to Dr. Zulfi Bhutta, and in the interest of time, I will be posting the details of his bio in the chat. But in short, Dr. Bhutta is the founding director of the Aga Khan University's Institute for Global Health and Development. And I will hand things over to you now, Dr. Bhutta.
Thank you very much, Diana, and welcome everybody, particularly our panelists and our invited speakers for today. We know that we have a wide variety of participants. We have over 600 registrants and people representing different ways of life and contexts. This is one of the several series of webinars that the Institute of Global Health and Development has been hosting over the last year, and has explored a variety of topics ranging from climate change to agriculture, food security, to the issues of human nutrition and gender equity. And today's topic is particularly important because we are just coming to the anniversary of the declaration of the global pandemic with COVID-19, which is still ongoing. And a big question being asked is how much of a hit have the global development and particularly sustainable development mandates have received as part of this pandemic response. I am absolutely thrilled with the panel that we have. We have Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who has joined us all the way from Colombia. He is, as widely regarded by many people, probably the world's best known economist. And his work over the last several decades, starting with his work at Harvard and then followed by his leadership at the Earth Institute in Colombia, has led the field in terms of how to actually implement many of the principles that he has espoused for sustainable development. Professor Sachs is currently the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia, and he's a university professor and also the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And I'm very pleased to report that that the Aga Khan University has been entrusted with the task of being a node for the SDSN partnership, something that we hope to do in very close collaboration with a fantastic institution in Pakistan, the Sustainable Development Policy Institute, led by Abid Suleri. Professor Sachs is a widely published author, and I will not spend more time on introducing him because I'm sure that you are all very keen to listen to him given the limited time today. We're also very pleased, and I'm particularly personally pleased that Professor Faisal Sultan, who is the special advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan with the rank of a Federal Minister of Health Services Regulation and Coordination, is with us today. I had requested Dr. Sultan to join us because we needed a sense of how, as someone who has led the COVID response in Pakistan, does he envision it being able to stabilize things and put us back on the SDGs achievement pathway. Dr. Faisal Sultan is a trained infectious disease specialist. He returned to Pakistan after higher education and training in the United States in the University of Connecticut and Washington University School of Medicine, and has been the chief executive officer of Shaukat Khanum Memorial Cancer Hospital in Lahore. And he's also been a lead academic and educator in the discipline for many years. We are very honored that we also have in the first part of the program Ms. Wendy Gilmore, who is the High Commissioner of Canada to Pakistan. And Ms. Gilmore joined the Canadian Foreign Service in 1990. And in looking at her background, she's distinguished herself by serving in a wide variety of conflict and post-conflict zones, ranging from Mozambique, Angola, Botswana, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo. So it's a who's who of where she has been able to provide services as a diplomat and a representative of the Canadian government. She's also served as the Deputy Director in the Eastern European Regional Security and Peacekeeping Division, and the Director of Peace Operations and Director of the Sudan Task Force. And we're very thrilled that she's able to join us today and to provide a few comments. But to get us going and to launch the session, I am very honored to introduce our Vice Provost, Dr. Alex Saviti, who has served as the founding director of the Earth Institute at Aga Khan University, where he joined. Dr. Viti is an ecosystem ecologist, with a PhD in the discipline, and was one of the alumni of the Commonwealth CSC Leaders Program, which is widely regarded as a global program for exceptional leaders. He's also on the board of governors of IDRC, and has in particular made his mark in Kenya, where he's regarded as probably the leading Kenyan intellectual with a finger on the pulse of sustainable development. So Alex, over to you to take us through this part of the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zulfi. Sometimes these accolades sound like you're at your own funeral, but thank you very much for a very gracious introduction. And good morning, good evening to everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here with you today. And good morning, especially to Jeff. What a pleasure to see you again. I'm so delighted that we have you here today to speak to a subject that has really defined your life's work. Sustainable development. So to set this up, Jeff, a comment, an editorial in the journal Nature in July 2020 argued that the pandemic has set back progress to the SDGs, and it is time to revise the 17 and 169 targets. Others have argued that the pandemic is a critical stress test and must be a catalyst for accelerated progress. Might we therefore argue that the pandemic has laid bare the full extent of the complex and interconnected social, economic, ecological, institutional, and governance challenges that the SDGs were designed to address in the first place? So over to you, Jeff, and we look forward to your top line commentary, and then I'll invite Wendy and Dr. Faisal Sultan to make some comments to your remarks. Thank you very much, and with that, over to you, Jeff.
Alex, thank you. So nice to be with you. Thanks to the Aga Khan University for inviting me. Thanks also to Dr. Bhutta for his leadership. And let me express my gratitude to the Aga Khan University for taking on the great challenges of the SDGs and for graciously hosting, co-hosting the new chapter of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network for Pakistan, which I think is very exciting and very promising. Well, it's an honor to be with all of you. Let me say that even before COVID-19, the SDGs were not in great shape. And with COVID-19, of course, the situation is even worse. So there's no sugarcoating the difficulties that the world faces. But the fact of the matter is we weren't trying very hard beforehand. And as Alex has just said, the one thing that COVID-19 could do is wake us up to the need to take seriously what we have set out to do. Now, the idea of sustainable development is a core idea that we have to change how this world works. The world works right now by a market system largely oriented to produce money, profits, but not to produce well-being, and not to produce environmental sustainability, and not to produce social justice. Market systems don't have any special facility for social justice. They create poverty alongside wealth. They create tremendous divisions within society, unless public policy reduces those inequalities. And markets certainly don't pay attention to protecting the environment, at least not the way that our markets function. The market system gives vent to greed with irresponsibility and with a great deal of known environmental destruction. The oil companies have known for decades that their product is threatening the planet. Doesn't matter. They lie, they cheat, they propagandize, but they want to continue to make money. That's a market system. So the idea of sustainable development is we have to get a grip on these two huge problems, the inequalities within and between countries, and the environmental destruction that is underway. And that environmental destruction is underway on many fronts. Climate change, which will be more and more devastating, destruction of land ecosystems and marine ecosystems, mega pollution, and the advent with increasing frequency of these new emerging infectious diseases, so-called zoonotic diseases, where a virus or some other pathogen passes from an animal population to humans. In this case, with COVID-19, the virus passed from horseshoe bats, probably through some intermediate mammalian species, a pangolin or some other species, to humans, and now has caused this worldwide disaster. Well, the point about sustainable development is, first, we need it. That's why all governments of the world agreed in September 2015 to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and a few weeks later to the Paris Climate Agreement. The second thing about sustainable development is it's not enough to say you're for it. We need public policies to change, regulate, shift the direction of market forces, redistribute income from the rich to the poor, ensure that the poor have access to basic services, protect the environment by limiting destructive activities, and so forth. That's why sustainable development is not just a nice homily, it's not just a nice sermon, it's an agenda for public policy. Now, even before COVID-19, many countries, most countries, were not on a trajectory to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Climate Agreement. Take my country, the United States. We were governed by a selfish, narcissistic psychopath, Donald Trump, in a system that caters to greed and that caters to illegality and corruption. The American political system is highly corrupt. Each election now is more than $10 billion changing hands between wealthy donors and the politicians who do their bidding. So we don't have a system in the United States that is socially fair, inclusive, or environmentally protective. President Biden is a gentleman and a much more decent person. Our political system remains broken, though. So whether we are able to really change course or not remains to be seen. But America is one of the most unequal societies in the world. It is a racist society to an important extent, and it is floundering with lack of public investments, lack of protection of the environment, lack of attention to the poor. And whether President Biden can alter this or not remains to be seen, because the country is divided right down the middle. Moreover, the United States is an incredibly ungenerous country. It's the richest country in the world in terms of the mass of the economy, but it gives very little to other countries. And Trump's mantra was keep cutting aid down to zero if he could, and take what you can from other countries. So the United States was also not abiding by any international responsibilities. It had pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Fortunately, President Biden brought the US back in during his first day of office on January 20th. The United States was cutting development aid, and the United States was engaged in all sorts of nefarious military and covert operations all over the world. Not sustainable development. So what can we say about this? Let me say one thing we can say is that if we put our minds to it, sustainable development is achievable. The world's actually rich. Even individual people like Jeffrey Bezos of Amazon has $200 billion of personal wealth. And he's not alone. About 500 people in this world have personal wealth of about $8 trillion. Can you imagine? Billions of people have nothing. And about 500 people in the world have $8 trillion. But they're not taxed. They control the politics. And this is why we don't achieve sustainable development, because we're not sharing, we are not reallocating, we're not helping poor children to have decent diets and to be able to go to school. And many of the rich behave with complete irresponsibility and recklessness regarding the environment. But we have the means through our wealth and our technology to solve the problems of poverty, social exclusion, and environmental degradation. In fact, we're sitting on really a gold mine of technological possibilities right now. Renewable energy has become as inexpensive as fossil fuels. We could decarbonize the world energy system, convert to sunshine, especially, also wind and hydropower. And by going to zero carbon energy, have plentiful energy, even highly distributed energy for people in rural areas using solar energy, and do so in a way which would protect us from the devastation of climate change. We just need the oil, the gas, and the coal producers to stop so that we change course to adopt renewable energy. We also have the benefits of digital technologies, because with digital technologies, if there is access to digital technologies, then every child can get part of the education online. Every person can get healthcare services through telemedicine. Government can be efficient in providing services online. Banking and commerce can be done online. The gains, the leapfrogging that countries could make in their standard of living through adopting digital technologies for all would be phenomenal. And those countries that have access for all to digital technologies, especially in East Asia, where internet use is very, very high, in China or Korea or other neighboring countries, have achieved big advances of living standards. But in Pakistan, access to the internet remains quite low, for example. So this form of leapfrogging is also still not fulfilled. So what do we need to do to get on the right course? We have to set aside our greed and short-termism. We have to have public policies that prevail on governments, not governments owning our not businesses owning our governments. We have to have redistributive budget systems to ensure that every child gets an education, that every person has access to basic infrastructure, electricity, internet, so that people can benefit from these services. And we need governments that are able to make plans that look ahead and that build economies with access for all and with environmental sustainability. Let me note that China celebrated in 2020 the end of extreme poverty. This is a hope for all of us. China was a country that had about 80% of the population in extreme poverty in 1980. By massive public investments in education, making China's education system one of the best in the world, by massive investments in infrastructure, power, water, sewerage, transport, intercity rail, digital. China built a modern infrastructure, and through a private economy that was outward oriented and producing innovations and jobs, China achieved within 40 years the end of extreme poverty as of 2020. So we know that rapid progress is possible. Alex asked, should we give up on the SDGs because of the setback of COVID-19? One could have asked that in 2019, even before COVID-19, because we were off track. The message is we cannot be safe if we remain with the kind of selfish and distorted public policies that we have. We need to orient all of our economies, rich and poor alike, to sustainable development, to decarbonization, to digital services that reach and benefit all. We need to tax higher incomes. We need to protect countries like Pakistan from the abuses of multinational companies, such as the ones that are suing Pakistan for a project that they never carried out, but are claiming billions of dollars in damages for something they never did. And that's an abuse of international justice. We need to have a system, in other words, that is fair to all countries and that invests for the future. No, we should not renegotiate the Sustainable Development Goals. We should achieve them by making the investments necessary and by operating with the transparency necessary. But that means holding the rich to account. Thanks very much. Thank you for letting me join you today.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I know you're pressed for time, but I would like to get two colleagues, Wendy and Faisal, just to weigh in on two critical points that you raised. And I'll start with Faisal. Faisal, would you comment on national policies in Pakistan that you think are on track to drive domestic investments in poverty alleviation and environmental sustainability? And with respect to poverty alleviation, I would like you to speak directly to investments in education, health, and more importantly, infant and maternal health, because I think this is really critical to getting women on the job market, women in schools, girls completing education, but also, if you have time, talk about food security, the dynamics as well. Because I think these are critical drivers to, as Jeff has always put it, to putting societies on the first rung of the ladder to climb onto progress.
Right. Thank you very much. It's going to be very difficult to follow something as erudite and as direct and as hard-hitting as what we just heard. But let me give it a shot and tell you what our thoughts are. I think the kind of inclusive and fair system that Dr. Sachs talks about, and that he has very clearly laid out today as a model for us to follow, is crucial to achieving and attaining not just sustainable development goals, but other ambitions and desires that many developing countries have. I'll take a few moments and use the present challenge of COVID-19 to talk about some of the challenges and the solutions, and they will answer all the questions that you raised. First and foremost, starting out, we had almost two countries. We had almost two Pakistans. One, the educated elite, who saw things from their prism, were reading up on mathematical extrapolations about epidemics and so on from very top-end academic institutions in the world, and were thinking in a way which really was somewhat alien, I should say, to the fundamental structure of our society. And then there was the other side, which almost was dismissive of what was going on. And so the job of the government was to have an inclusive, sane, sustainable, and sensible, scientifically rooted response to this. And crucial in that, and I'll talk a little bit about the rest of the science, but crucial within that was to ensure that the weakest parts of society don't get left out. So the Poverty Elevation Division, as part of the ESAS program, made sure that we were able to actually reach out to the poorest of the poor to actually make sure that in the darkest days of the shutdown, lockdown, the Pakistan version of it, if you will, that some people at least got reprieve and were not left out. But while this was going on, many of us worried on what it was going to do to our overall health infrastructure, our programs, our goals that we were far from to begin with and would look further away once the dust had settled. And so it was crucial to be able to muddle through with or through the pandemic and through the shutdown and the lockdown and other restrictions and the economic slowdown that was almost predictable that would come from all these slowdowns, to reach a point where you were able to deliver or to start to redeliver some of the care that was going on or that was required. Not surprisingly, but it reflected our commitment to ensure that we were thinking of long-term and sustainable goals. We were able to agree with our provinces through the thick of this, through the thick of the pandemic, on interventions or an agreed set of interventions to have a universal health, a UHC package to ensure that we are able to impact some of the very intransigent problems that are plaguing our society, all the way from malnutrition to infections to chronic diseases. And so I think that while this was a huge and massive challenge, it also provided us with two things. One, it brought in the issue of well-being center stage, and it highlighted very clearly that even in a very divided society, even in a society with massive differences between the poor and the rich, this pandemic was a grand equalizer. and actually showed how unless we have an inclusive system that actually protects everybody, the privileged few will just not be able to get out of this, alive, if you will. So that center staging of health and well-being and the need for investment into credible, good, robust systems was the first thing that I think shot back at us from the challenge, the opportunity that literally leapt out at us. And the second one was the ability to leapfrog. I think that a lot of countries and a lot of people were quite surprised and almost in disbelief about the response and reaction that some of us were able to put together with a fraction of the effort or a fraction of the investment, and to do it in a relative quick time. I think it required commitment, it required a little bit of luck, and a bunch of other things that came together to make sure that we were able to respond to this challenge in a scientific, coherent way. Obviously, nothing is perfect in a situation like this, and it's always a work in progress, and we're currently struggling as we speak with the challenges of today. But at the end of the day, it did provide us with this opportunity of fixing how we think of not just healthcare, but how it fits in the society at large. So I think from my perspective, what I would tell you is that here we are still not through it. It's not over yet. But what it's taught us are these two important lessons, that without an inclusive across the board public health system that's really merged into the rest of our society, which includes things well past health, and the second is the opportunity that it provides to actually do a hard reset and do a hard fix. And I'm just coincidentally, just this morning or afternoon, I should say, we got our board approved for our new, as I call it, the NIH2, with a new health data center, with the Centers for Disease Control, with a center for population welfare, for malnutrition or for nutrition, as well as some redo of existing entities and centers that existed within it. So it is tough, but I don't think it is all doom and gloom. It certainly is a time for us to ask ourselves what kind of world we wish to leave our kids to. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Faisal. So, Wendy, I would like to bring you into the discussion. And Jeff characterized the United States as being ungenerous. According to the OECD 2021 Global Outlook on Financing Sustainable Development, developing countries face a staggering 1.7 trillion in financing that they would need in 2021 to keep on track on the SDGs. It's projected that this financial shortfall could top 4.2 trillion in the next few years. My question to you is, from your perspective as a Canadian diplomat, what are some of the things that we need to think about to re-engineer global cooperation to basically start getting money on track? The SDGs cost money, but they will yield incredible dividends if we finance these development goals to create a much more prosperous and stable society. So just your thoughts on kind of the architecture of global, of international development financing, bringing in international cooperation around specifically bridging the shortfall in SDG funding. We understand most sectors, public, private, have been pummeled by the pandemic, but we can't cop out. So what could we cobble together as a new architecture for global development financing?
So first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you tonight, or this morning, depending on where your time zone is and your perspective on sleep. But it is just a pleasure both to listen to Dr. Sachs and of course Dr. Sultan, who is a very good colleague for all of the donor community here in Islamabad and Pakistan, but also a world leading expert in his own right. I think just maybe very general comment on the reaction to the pandemic itself and the response to the SDGs. There is no question but that we have seen a significant contraction in all economies around the world. The global economic value has fallen significantly. For the first time in some time, relative levels of poverty have increased as opposed to decreased. And what we're seeing in particular, including in places here in Pakistan, but also in Canada and around the world, but the downturn in the global economy and the deprivations caused by our response to the pandemic are impacting marginalized communities and in particular impacting women. And while all of the SDGs are important and they work together as a comprehensive plan in order to support sustainable development, SDG 5, as it relates to women, is something that's very near and dear to Canada's heart. We have a feminist foreign policy. We have a feminist international assistance policy. We try and look at all of our development programming through the lens of its impact on gender and its support for women and girls. And it's devastating to see what has been happening as a result of pandemic response and the response by many governments around the world to how to manage the health risks associated with the pandemic, while at the same time understanding that there still needs to be the delivery of basic services. I think Dr. Sultan laid it out here in Pakistan. The government of Pakistan really realized that very early on, that the impact on the most vulnerable and marginalized communities was going to be significant, and tried to deliver a COVID response that was mindful of that. And programs like the SAS program that Dr. Sania Nishtar, one of Dr. Sultan's colleagues in cabinet, have put in place that allow for resources to flow directly to the most vulnerable, and in particular to women, have been really commendable. But specifically with the question on development financing, one of the trends that's been very interesting in development over the past decade plus has been a real understanding of capital flows and the impact of private sector development on developing economies. And frankly, that private sector inflows often dwarf the amount of development financing available. And it really is those countries which are embracing market principles and I absolutely hear you, Dr. Sachs, with respect to those market principles have to be responsible. They have to take into account the regulation that's necessary to ensure that it's not just do no harm, but it's positive private sector development. And that the labor standards and environmental standards, and frankly, our understanding of social benefit to private sector development is integrated into the policy surrounding it. But irrespective, private sector development drives development. It creates wealth. It allows for an expansion of education. It allows for an expansion of health services. And really where I think a lot of donors are focusing their efforts, certainly donors like Canada, is how do we help create the enabling environment so that larger swaths of the population that have been marginalized, that have been disadvantaged in capital development and market development, are able to also have benefit. And as I say, for us, that really means a focus on women and girls. We have programs for women's voice and leadership. We have programs for women's political participation. We have programs that are just starting up with a good partner of ours, the Aga Khan Development Network, and including the Aga Khan University, that focus explicitly on maternal and child health, women's sexual and reproductive health, on the ability of women to manage family planning and family spacing in a way that helps them take care of themselves and their families. And these are the types of things that are absolutely necessary that we don't lose focus on as we are crafting a response collectively as donors to support countries like Pakistan and elsewhere. And again, even in Canada, we have significant swaths of our population that has not been able to take advantage of market gains as others have, and it exacerbates the inequalities that exist in our societies. So it's really making sure that as we enter into the recovery period from the pandemic, hopefully soon with the availability of vaccines, and that we ensure that countries like Pakistan and elsewhere have access to vaccines in a way that is going to allow them to rejoin global commerce and global travel and engagement, that we focus on these long-term goals. We've been doing a lot of retooling of our development programming in the last year to respond to the most urgent and pressing needs. Now we have to make sure that we haven't lost the plot on these longer term efforts. But I would say that some of the most interesting and innovative approaches to development lately have been in concessional approach to development financing. So in Canada, we have a new organization, relatively new, I suppose, called FinDev, which allows for development financing. One of our most successful inward foreign investments in Pakistan, in concert with a lot of other development financing organizations, is a Canadian company who is investing in renewable energy, in wind power. And companies like that come in with, we like to think, an ability to work with their Pakistan counterparts on things like corporate social responsibility, on labor standards, environmental practices, and at the same time in healthy development, job creation, working not only with local communities, but also with specialized communities that are going to promote environmentally sustainable development. That's where we have a real impact. And that's where development financing comes into play, that helps absorb some of the business risk of these companies investing in markets like Pakistan and elsewhere around the world. This particular company is also in Rwanda and in Malawi. I'm losing one more in East Africa. So it is, and I think, you know, Canada is fairly well known for, I would like to think that our approach to things is responsible development. It is good governance. It's creating the necessary conditions to allow for broad-based participation in the economy while taking care of the most vulnerable. And we can't lose sight of that because of this overwhelming health and, you know, risk health situation that we found ourselves in the last year.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So Jeff, I know you're pressed for time, so it gives you time to make your concluding comments and perhaps maybe give some responses to the very articulate commentary from our two panelists.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the comments of the panelists. We are going to have to do better than we've been doing, whatever we think and whatever the rhetoric. We're just wildly off track to make the climate safe for the world, to stop environmental destruction, and to help countries like Pakistan get out of the rut of poverty. It just is a much larger scale venture than we like to think. Our companies are not at the stage of doing good in general. They're not even at the stage of not doing bad. At least in the United States, evil reigns, I'm sorry to tell you, just to put it crudely. This is an abusive system of power, and there is no accountability right now. I'm watching, for example, the attacks on Pakistan. I mentioned in a tribunal of a Canadian mining company, Barrick's Mining, and a Chilean mining company suing Pakistan for billions of dollars of damages for a project they didn't do at all. They didn't do anything, but they got 3 arbitrators to say, well, you would have made $5 billion if that project had gone ahead. It happened that the Pakistan Supreme Court said the project was not eligible, but no, we don't listen to the Pakistan Supreme Court. We don't listen to courts of other countries. And we have this abusive tribunal backing up an abusive Canadian company and an abusive Chilean company that would make a damage claim much more than the entire healthcare budget of the country. So this is where, and what's happening today is that they're going out to attach property all over the world of the Pakistan government. When are we going to have a system that is fair and that is just, and where the mining companies don't rule the show? We don't have that right now. And this is really our grim reality. We're in the hands of the worst. Well, we just escaped. We were in the hands of the utter worst with Trump. Now we're just still in the grips of a system that does not limit its own greed. And so maybe if Barrick's gold would back off and its partner would back off and Pakistan could breathe again and use the billions of dollars that are being claimed from it for its economic development, then we would start getting somewhere. So that's what I'm hoping we can do, which is to take seriously the goals that we've set and ask how much they cost to meet, where the investments are going to come from, plan together for the future, understand that those who have just need to keep their greed a little under control, that no foreign company has the right to claim profits for projects that it didn't even do, and where the local court system said that the contracts were not proper. We have to learn to respect courts in other countries. Canada should respect the courts of Pakistan. The United States should respect the courts of Pakistan. Chile should respect the courts of Pakistan. This is all over the world happening. There was a judgment against Shell in Nigeria. And then the High Court in the UK said, well, we don't accept the High Court of Nigeria rulings. What kind of justice is this? I thought we were done with the imperial era. So this, I think, is where we really need to turn if we're going to solve these problems. It's interesting, by the way, Pakistan, thanks God, has done a good job of keeping this pandemic under control. The United States not. Pakistan, as I understand it, has had fewer than 15,000 deaths from COVID-19. The United States, 525,000 deaths. So congratulations for that. This is showing what can be accomplished. It's very important. Please keep up that success. This is still a very, very dangerous pandemic, but let's work towards truly building back in a just way and tell the powers of abuse that their time is up because we've run out of space for this kind of greed in the world. Thanks very much for having me with you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Enjoy the rest of your morning. Always a pleasure.
Thanks to everybody. Great.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
So we still have a few minutes to the top of the hour. So I would like to bring it back to our two panelists for some further reflection. So Faisal, your presentation of the Pakistani government intervention is pretty compelling. My question to you would be, how do you imagine reprioritizing of public policy focus and government spending in terms of, to use kind of an abused term called stimulus or public financing to incentivize new behavior or entrench certain existing trajectories of good behavior. For instance, around some of the sectors that you probably have identified as the worst hit by the pandemic. You talked about health, you talked about education, you talked about small business. Where in the scheme of this do you feel, in terms of kind of reimagining the recovery process to kind of go back to the country's commitment to the SDGs, would most of the effort and heavy lifting go?
Okay, first, very focused specifically on the business areas or the work areas that you mentioned, education, small businesses. So what's happened already, and then what could happen, a little bit of imagination ahead. So what's happened already is that we were able to restart a lot of the businesses despite the stoppage that occurred for a few weeks in the beginning of the pandemic. But we were able to restart the businesses in a number of different ways. As I mentioned, one of the industries that we felt drove some of our recovery was construction. In our context, most of it was considered relatively low risk for COVID. And so with some due precautions, it was opened up, and actually it became the engine for initial recovery. I'm not an economist or an expert on this, but I think it also led to subsequent startup and improvement in at least production, and then eventually in sales and so on, of other industries that feed on the construction industry. So in addition to this, we were able to give utility breaks for electricity and gas and so forth to small and medium businesses directly into their bills through a fairly automated and centrally controlled system that provided some reprieve to businesses that were hurting. The two work areas that have continued to suffer, I think, importantly, are the service or the food and beverage industry, as well as the education industry. We've had understandably, the proportion of population in our country that is in schools relative to other countries because of our population pyramid is, of course, much larger, and therefore has much greater leverage into how the pandemic gets affected. In fact, we're currently going through what people are thinking is the third wave or a fourth wavelet. And I think temporarily speaking, it seems to have some association with the fact that our education sector opened. But the problem is that a lot of our schools are small mom and pop schools out and serving a very large part of the population, filling up gaps. And they work on very thin margins, relatively speaking. So therefore, that's one industry that has hurt, and we really do need to try to salvage it. But at this point, and we've had a number of closures of these small schools with attendant damages, not just to the economy, but also to the education that they were providing right near doorsteps and very close to homes. And the other industry, of course, is the restaurant and the hospitality industry. Again, because of how we felt the pandemic was impacted by indoor dining and so on, that was one industry that has suffered and hurt. We expect some recovery, but we really do need to get past this present wave before we can be sure that we can open these with confidence. Of course, imperative and very important with it would be large-scale vaccination, something that we are lagging behind in at this time.
Thanks, Faisal. So Wendy, kind of very last words in this segment. You talk about the Canadian focus on gender, and being a member of the IDRC board, this really energizes a lot of the conversations in terms of how we imagine development support and research programming. Could you give some commentary on how you might reimagine mobilizing private sector engagement as a critical partner in inclusive development? Faisal's talked about all of the potential tracks for reprioritizing the recovery phase. How, given your front row seat as this unfolds, what do you see as some of the interesting kind of bilateral recovery financing opportunities with respect to the Pakistani context, which I'm sure you're very familiar with?
So thank you very much. I certainly hear Dr. Satz in his perspective on some of the activities of private sector organizations. I would obviously have a very different view of the one particular case that he was mentioning, but there is no question but that a global standard of corporate governance, of corporate behavior, of corporate social responsibility would be great to have. And certainly Canada has made some efforts along that front, particularly with our own companies in both domestic law and regulation with respect to their activities abroad. But on the question of sort of where are the opportunities? I mean, I think it's a really interesting, both interesting and really important speculation as to what the economy is going to look like coming out of the pandemic. What are the elements? What are the trends that we have observed that will continue especially since, I mean, day by day, we're learning more about what the pandemic is going to look like longer term, what the impact of the vaccines is going to be, how infectious does the disease remain even with the vaccines in place? What does that mean for our behavior and our ability to figure out, what is the new normal going to look like? And even Dr. Sachs mentioned sort of one of the really important elements of the SDGs is extending economic opportunity to all and leveraging modern technologies to do so. So one of the things we've all learned over the last year, and we're seeing online right this evening, is that we have the ability to connect with people over the internet using technology in a way that we wouldn't have envisaged, or at least we wouldn't have taken advantage of a year ago. And that means for countries like Pakistan, maybe some of the focus in economic recovery should be transcending the digital divide, getting access to the internet out to as many different communities as possible. From our gender lens, understanding that access to digital tools tends to be severely circumscribed for women in many societies, in particular in Pakistan, but also elsewhere. And that modern commerce is going to depend on electronic means, e-commerce, more so than ever before. And so what we have to do is figure out, how do we invest in the tools necessary to allow the communities recovering from the pandemic, the communities that are already experiencing a level of poverty, how do we get the tools into their hands so that they can take advantage of some of these more modern ways of doing business? How do we do the leap from into, I don't know if we're calling it the fourth or the fifth industrial revolution at the moment, but how do we make the leap to a digital economy that gives, for example, women who may not have the ability to travel or have societal norms that don't allow them to engage to the same extent that men do, maybe that's a tool that they can use to get access to economic opportunity and elsewhere. It's getting financing sorted out, financial instruments, the financial vehicles, so that marginalized communities can have access to them. And there's been tremendous effort over the last couple of decades to understand the benefits of microfinance and microfinance related banks. Well, we have now compounded challenges in financial institutions by virtue of global norms with respect to money transfers and financing that's actually squeezing out microfinance from some aspects of development activity. So that's something that we can't, again, sort of a longer term effort, but at this particular moment in the pandemic, as small businesses will have to start up again, as remittance flows may come into a country, how do we ensure that that happens, number one, as part of the formal economy, but number two, that are not unduly impacted by some very good intentioned policies that actually restrict financial transfers. So there's a whole bunch of really important issues that I know Abid's been thinking a lot about these, and SPDI has been doing some great work in Pakistan and with a number of partners, but thinking about how do you ensure a more equitable economic development? How do you leverage new tools? And frankly, how do we actually try and make the pandemic, it will never be positive, but how do we learn some of the behaviors from the pandemic that allow us to connect and to access sort of different means of production, different means of development, and then carry that forward as we enter into the recovery.
Wendy and Faisal, thank you very much for a great conversation. And in his absence, I want to thank Jeff Sachs for his always absolutely passionate and provoking commentary on a subject that is absolutely close to his heart. Zolfi, I would like to turn this back to you for the next segment. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this wonderful first session, for shepherding this, and to our honored guests, Dr. Faisal Sultan, the Federal Minister of Health, and Ms. Wendy Gilmore, the Honorable High Commissioner from Canada. Thank you very much for your thoughtful comments. This has been quite a fascinating insight into both the macro world of sustainable development and how some of the pressures and challenges compound the crisis that we've had with COVID-19. So thank you very much for your support, for your leadership, and thank you especially, Faisal, for shepherding us through a very dark time and shepherding us successfully. I agree with you that we are not out of this yet, and that's why the Sustainable Development Goals remain important, because we've got to rebuild with all of that at hand. So ladies and gentlemen, I would like to now turn to our next part of the program, which is absolutely thrilling, because what we now will have is from the three distinguished invited guests, a perspective on exactly how do we get into the weeds, how do we do things. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our three panelists, distinguished panelists. So Dr. Abid Suleri is no stranger to people in sustainable development. He has been heading the Sustainable Development Policy Institute, Pakistan's premier research policy think tank, for the last 13 years. Dr. Suleri has a PhD, importantly in the issue of food security from Greenwich, but he has been on a phenomenal number of important national committees and task forces, including the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, the Advisory Council of the Planning Commission of Pakistan. He's been the convener of the Food Security Advisory Group at the National Security Division, Government of Pakistan, and a member of the think tanks network. He's also been a member of the organizing committee of the South Asia Economic Summit. So he's had a pole position in terms of looking at some of this. And in my own interests in interacting with him, I've been thoroughly impressed by his vision from the angle of someone who knows the subject, from the range of global economics, regional trade policies, political economy of development. So we really look forward to your participation, Abid. And in the work of the SDSN Pakistan node, our role is to work very closely with you in implementing some of the work that academic centers and organizations might do in collaboration with public policy members. So we also have two young leaders as part of our panel, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Wafa Aftab. Wafa is a faculty member in the Department of Community Health Sciences, where she has had a diverse research interest on health policy and governance around nutrition, non-communicable diseases, HIV/AIDS, but especially her recent work in partnership with some of us on looking at the implementation of health and health-related sustainable development goals, which led to several important publications in the BMJ. She's a Fulbright scholar and has a master's in public health from GWU in Washington, D.C., and she teaches public health and law and ethics at the department. Our third panelist is Ms. Mehreen Mubashir, who is the Development Associate and Parliamentary Researcher in the SDGs Secretariat in Parliament. She is responsible for policy matters and day-to-day running of the National Parliamentary Task Force on Sustainable Development Goals. She's a graduate in political science from the Kinnaird College, and where she did her thesis on parliamentary affairs. And lo and behold, where did she end up? Exactly in walking the talk. So we're very grateful, Mehreen, that you are able to be with us. So I want to start by offering you the floor. We have a lot of questions from the floor that we'll get into, but in the time that we have, and we have ample time, thankfully, I'd like to start by just asking you to reflect a little bit on what you heard, and very specifically, maybe say something about what gives you hope in the context of Pakistan and sustainable development. So maybe I'll start with you, Abid.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhutta. You see, in case of Pakistan, I would say that this COVID-19, it has a lot of silver lining when we talk of sustainable development goals. So in Pakistan, when we used to look at the current account expenditures, and I call them 4 Ds. The first 3 Ds were mandatory, which is debt servicing. The second one is defense and security, and third one is day-to-day administration. So those were non-mandatory expenditure. No government could have compromised on it. And the fourth one, development, that was very often something that governments, they could very easily tend to either slash down, or they could have shifted the budget from development to the first 3 mandatory expenditures. Now this COVID-19, it has brought back the social sector development on the policy radar. We were warned of 3 crises at the beginning. That was health crisis, it was economic recession, and it was food security. And we realized, and as Dr. Faisal Sultan has rightly mentioned, Pakistan by virtue of focusing on health, where in February 2020, we had to send our samples to China to diagnose whether a patient was contracted with the COVID-19 or not, where we were lacking those face masks and sanitizers and ventilators, etc. Today, we realized that our public health infrastructure is very resilient and able to cope with the COVID-19 vagaries. Similarly, in economic recession, again, Dr. Faisal Sultan has covered a lot, but the social sector protection, I think that is one of the flagship thing, reaching to 12 million households in a very short span of time, paying them digitally direct cash transfer. So it again tells us that the focus of sustainable development is back on the policy radar. Yes, we are doing it through debts, but for the first time, I'm actually advocating to take more debts and more loans as long as they are spent on sustainable development goals and as long as they are spent on reducing these inequalities, social inequality. Environment and climate change, again, it remained a focus, and Prime Minister's program whereby people those were getting paid for plantation, green and clean recovery program, and debt swapping. I think that is again something which is positive. And finally, I think this COVID-19, it has made our transition towards fourth industrial revolution at a much faster pace. We could have never imagined to adapt online medicine, online shopping, online education, online offices, working from home, etc. All these things a year ago, had someone told us, I think we were not ready for it, but within a year time, we have actually embarked upon it. And all these things, as I said, those are silver lining for me. And I think that using the potential and using this window of opportunity, one can make our transition to sustainable development goals maybe at a much faster pace.
Fantastic. I mean, so that's a really optimistic look at how do you look at some of the positive benefits from this experience. Wafa, your views.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bhutta. I think Dr. Saleri has touched on some of the really key points, and I would agree with some of them, especially that the response to this pandemic in Pakistan has really brought the focus on some of the inequities that perhaps we didn't see them talked about as much, especially in our political discourse. So I see that as really positive. And the way that we've been able to, bring in resources, especially for the Prime Minister's program, to give people unconditional cash transfers who've been affected by COVID. I think that's really positive, but also great to see because it reflects a political will to invest in people who may have been left behind, which is exactly the sort of sentiment and political will that we need to see for the equitable implementation of SDGs. And of course, digital education, as Dr. Saleri said, I think we would not have been able to see this quick transformation to digital education in the next 10 to 15 years that we've seen in the 1 year. Of course, there are gaps in terms of, and gaps and inequities in terms of, internet access and people from different socioeconomic status. But I think this is a real opportunity where we can also reduce the number of out-of-school children and primary education improvement. And finally, I think it's also brought to the fore how closely economy and health are interconnected. I think which was not a connection that was made frequently before this pandemic. So you cannot have a good economy without having good health and vice versa. So I think that's an important connection.
Well, wonderful. Mehreen, your views. What's been the silver lining?
I would like to share the Parliament's perspective towards the entire discussion. My fellow panelists have shared the ground root realities and the practicalities of SDGs agenda. But as you asked, what is hope for me when it comes to SDGs? And that is, I think, when the National Assembly, your legislators, the National Assembly, when they passed the unanimous resolution of translating the SDGs agenda, the global agenda, into a national agenda, we now recognize this agenda as Pakistan's development agenda. So I think that for me is hope when your legislators, your lawmakers have ownership of this agenda. Further, I think the SDG Secretariat itself is, defining that we should all consider ourselves as the stakeholders of this 17 goals. And coming from Parliament House, I think we still have hope. No doubt, Mr. Jeffrey Sachs have presented a very hard-hitting image, a very hard-hitting reality of how the world is going, how COVID-19 has affected the SDGs, the targets and goals. But I still think that if the ownership, if Parliament and the lawmakers have ownership of this 17 goals, there's still hope.
Fantastic, fabulous. So we'll have one more round and then I'll go to the questions. And I want to ask you the provocative question, maybe starting with you, Mehreen, in the reverse order, as to what fills you with dread? What is it that you worry about in the context of SDGs, COVID-19 and Pakistan?
What I exactly worry about is the lack of ownership coming from the grassroots stakeholders. What I worry about is the lack of awareness among the people, the youth of this agenda. This is the most talked about thing internationally, but when it comes to Pakistan, there is no education. There are no courses being offered. There are, SDGs are considered to be something related to IR, international relations only. But I think this is beyond that. We need our youth to be engaged in, we need our academia to be engaged, we need our media to be engaged, and we need to, we need to educate the masses. The laws, the legislators, knowing and understanding these 17 goals or these 169 indicators is not enough. We need to translate this agenda into national, provincial, and grassroots level. This is, I think, worrisome for me because this was supposedly the decade of action. We have already missed out. We have already wasted a lot of years. But now I think we should get up and we should start translating this into the language for masses. We should start translating it for, we should start incorporating these SDGs agenda into our daily lives. This is what I think should be done. And this is worrisome.
And Wafa, same question to you. What is it that you dread in the context of COVID-19 and SDGs for Pakistan?
Well, the most obvious thing for me is if somehow we're unable to vaccinate, all of our population or a large part of our population relatively quickly, we're going to keep having these, multiple cycles of, as soon as you open up, you have another cycle. And it's going to affect the economy, it's going to affect education, it's going to affect health service delivery, which is going to have a negative impact across all of these areas. So vaccination and how quickly we can get it done. To me, currently, the amount of vaccine we have from COVAX, et cetera, is only enough to cover a very small portion of our population. So that's my concern. How are we going to manage to vaccinate all of our population? And the other one is, how is the economic fallout of the pandemic affect long-term sustainable investment in the social sector, which has never been generous in this country, and may suffer further because of the economic fallout.
Abid, the final word on this round in the context of challenges or what really concerns you?
Yes, there are a couple of things that I feel are prerequisites. And first and most important is the institutional arrangement. We know we have federal government and provincial governments in place, but the third tier local governments, those are missing in all the provinces. And in order to have a meaningful progress on sustainable development goals, we require real ownership where it matters, and that is the local
17 goals is overambitious, perhaps, and maybe a pie in the sky. So what do you say to that?
Well, I can cluster them in three categories. The first 6 goals perhaps is the unfinished agenda of MDGs, something that we were required to do in any way. The next 6 goals, those are the drivers, something which would help us in achieving those MDGs in a better manner. And the last 5 goals, I think this is what is at stake. If we don't deliver on the first 6 goals through the next 6 goals, then we are putting the life on earth at stake, at risk, life under water at risk, peace and justice at risk, the whole environment and climate at risk. So these are the 3 clusters, and you can also perhaps classify them in this people, the first 6 goals as people, and then you can look at the prosperity, and then the planet, and then the partnership, and then the peace and justice. So while you can find 17, they are just 3 or 5 clusters on which we have to work, and those are integrated and mutually non-exclusive. So you can't achieve any 16 of them leaving the 17th out. So it's all in one type of thing that we have to work in a holistic manner, in a transdisciplinary manner.
I completely agree. I mean, I think these are aspirational. I mean, you know, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, but if you don't start taking those steps, you will never move towards it. And to the credit of this particular government, is the first government after many years that has, you know, done something about deforestation, that has openly spoken about environmental change, and is openly spoken about issues that are in the context of equity. And you know, we haven't heard this language of equity and justice since the time of the first tenure of the People's Party that brought it into power in the 60s. So Vafa, I wanted to turn to you to ask that, as a young person who looks at the future, and the future does belong to the current youth, and I've heard you and others claim and speak about the disengagement. But what is the excitement of the SDG agenda around reducing disparities that you think may augur well for the future, and how can we achieve it?
Yeah, so Dr. as you mentioned, you know, when we look at some of the discussions about inequities that we're having, not just in this country, but across the world globally, it sort of harks back to the kind of discussions we had. Well, I wasn't there, but in the 60s or 70s, and it seems that we have come full circle. We have experienced one way of developing economies, and now we're rethinking our strategy. So I think that's what gives me hope that a lot of young people all across the world are thinking about economies, equity, climate in integrated ways, so that the way we organize our economies should be friendly to the climate. They should not create equities so huge, the kind that we see these days in our world. So I think it's that growing feeling and almost a movement across the world, led by I think younger people, which gives me hope for the future.
Well, that's a great segue to Mehreen, and you also lamented about civic society disengagement. I mean, what can we do tangibly in terms of firing the imagination of the young people out there, both from a parliamentary perspective, as prospective vote bank, but also as citizens? I mean, how do we make certain that people are engaged? I mean, I reflect back on the late 60s and 70s, where the global revolution was led by young people out in the streets, whether it was through protest movements, whether it was Vietnam firing people out. And you saw that across the world, irrespective of where they lived. You saw similar protests in Pakistan with the university student bodies out screaming for justice. Why isn't this happening in terms of sustainable development and the global, pressures that we face? We had Greta Thunberg, who led this global movement, but we also see that that's quietened somewhat. COVID has dampened some of that speech in recent years. So please tell me what you think.
What I think is that to involve youth in this agenda, it'll only come if the youth is willing to own this agenda. I believe that these 17 goals are for us, for the youth, and for the coming generations. But what I think is that there is not enough involvement of the youth in this agenda currently in Pakistan specifically. There are no courses, as I said earlier, there are no courses being offered. There is no education. There is no information regarding these goals in any university. I remember opting for an optional course in Kinnaird College to understand the MDGs and then the SDGs. It was an optional course. But I think, however, we should make SDGs, the understanding the UN system, mandatory for all graduating students. And I think we should offer them such internships which allow them to participate and be present on the tables of decision making, since they are the only, I think, major stakeholders, since they are the biggest stakeholder of this agenda. I think they should be on the decision making table. Further, what I think is that there is no sensitization of the youth regarding this topic. They are only engaged in unko they've been given they're chalked out subjects. There is no understanding of how to protect the climate or how to avail such opportunities. They are limited down. The options for Pakistani children, the Pakistani youth, is limited down. And I think this is the major concern where youth lacks. This is what I think.
Okay, well, wonderful. So my dear friend Murad Musa Khan has been pestering with questions around the whole issue of ethics, and why do we not call it for what it is, the behavior of whether it's multinationals or the behavior of even organizations around healthcare within Pakistan, which are not multinational, which are ours. Why do so few leaders not mention ethics? We hardly hear about this in the discourse of politicians who are all over the place, but we see justification for many of the things that others would regard as unethical. So how closely linked is the ethics agenda with the Sustainable Development Goals agenda? I come to you, Abid. This may be a bit of an unfair question, but and I want to put you on the spot, but that's what think tanks are for. So tell us, how do we mainstream this?
Well, I feel ethics is something which is over-discussed in Pakistan. The only problem is that each one of us we stick to our own ethics, and we try to remain very possessive about them, simply rejecting all voices which dissent, whether it's in the political arena or in the religious arena or in any other arena. But linking it with Sustainable Development Goals, I think it is something that starts with the person. It's a collective responsibility. So when I talk of ethics, what I mean to say that first of all, my contribution towards Sustainable Development Goals, whether I'm able to contribute something towards them, whatever I can do, and then I will expect my neighbors to do it, and then my community and my society and my country and my government. But if we are talking of simply a top-down approach, and we think that it is the rest of the world which would come and which would solve our problem, or if I keep on expecting that my neighbors, they would come and they would tell me to take my children to school or take my ailing family members to hospital, or follow the practices of Watson, etc. So that's not going to happen. So in all this ethics debate, I have to first correct myself. If I can contribute towards Sustainable Development Goals, then perhaps I can expect from others to do it. That's what I feel.
Okay. All right. Any thoughts on this, Wafa, yourself? I mean, you teach ethics at AKU. How much traction there is for mainstreaming that within our development agenda?
I think I mean, we can think about ethics at two levels: at how we make individual decisions and individual choices, but also how societies make choices. And I think when it comes to sustainable development goals, the whole concept of distributive justice is very much at the center of sustainable development goals. When we talk about reducing inequities, making sure that we put priority on disadvantaged groups, whether it's in terms of economic prosperity, in terms of opportunities in life. I think that's very much in line with the whole concept of distributive justice. And also, I mean, there are various aspects of environmental justice that align with it. So my very thinking about it from a societal perspective, I think it's very much aligned with the whole idea of distributive justice. And there are many different ways of achieving distributive justice, and there's a whole separate conversation. But I think that's, to me, that's the sort of the crux of societal ethics on which SDGs touch upon.
Yeah, true. So Mehreen, I want to come back to you to ask about the gender dimensions of some of this, and in particular, how this COVID-19 lockdowns or mitigation strategies could have worsened gender inequities in Pakistan. What is the sense in the parliament on this being a real issue?
Well, if we look with the perspective of gender, I think COVID-19 has raised the numbers of the gender-based violence increased, and this was a highly talked upon topic in the parliament. The sub-convener on SDG 5, Ms. Shandana Gulzar Khan, specially initiated a meeting regarding this topic and generated a debate inside the parliament. And I think that was a very healthy thing to do. So yes, the COVID-19 did, resulted in a higher numbers of gender-based violence in Pakistan. And other than that, Parliament, I think, other than that, I would like to share that women particularly are very active when it comes to SDGs agenda. And I would like to present Parliament's view in terms of this, as I say that we have a very high number of female representation in our task force, in the National Parliamentary Task Force. I think out of 63, approximately 42 are female and other are male. And other than that, we have subgroups now within the task force who are dedicatedly working with specific areas of SDGs, dedicatedly working on definitive SDG goals. And out of 19 sub-conveners, we have 13 to 14 female conveners. So I think there's a very high voice to female when it comes to SDGs agenda inside the parliament, and raising concerns and talking about issues which were raised during COVID-19 related to women. And other than that, not just COVID, everyday issues which we hear in news and which should be talked upon are well represented in the parliament and well representative in the task force of SDGs.
Thank you. I would encourage the participants, and we have still over 120 participants, is to encourage them to send their questions in the Q&A and keep them coming in. I'm going to digress a little bit and ask our panelists a pointed question. This is a hypothetical, but it's an important hypothetical because it's been raised on the international fora, and I would like to explore what you think of this in the context of Pakistan. So it's been said that some of the best COVID response has been in countries which have had female leadership. And this is an important observation also because yesterday was International Women's Day. So I want you to maybe give me a perspective one way or the other. If it's true that we can only really achieve SDGs in Pakistan if we had a gender lens and maybe a greater preponderance of female leadership at all levels, not just as the head of state, but at the level of local government, at the level of provincial governments, and at the level of the federal government. So give me a reaction to this. Is this perhaps a pie in the sky again? Or is this something that we really ought to aspire to? Abid.
Well, of course, there is no denial of the fact that we have to bring our very abled women leaders in all walks of life in the mainstream. And one of the best response within Pakistan's response to COVID is a SAS program. And we know that the SAS program is very brilliantly led by Dr. Sania Nishta, who has actually expanded Benazir Income Support Program to a lot of other diversified programs, Esas Kafalat and Esas Mazdoor and Esas Shelter Panaga and various others. So that is, she's one of the examples, but not only in the social protection, we have to have gendered policies. All the pros and cons of whatever we are doing, whether in response to COVID or other day-to-day policies, our policymakers, they ought to assess how they would be affecting men and women differently, and how to be more proactive to mitigate the negative impacts of those policies on women. If we don't do it, I don't see Pakistan achieving sustainable development goals.
Bapa?
Yes, so I think in terms of Pakistan, we have an example. I mean, Dr. Sania Nishta is a great example, but also in terms of our two key social protection program, the Benazir Income Support Program and the Lady Health Worker Program, so both instituted in the tenure of a female prime minister. It may also have had something to do with her political ideology. Of course, left-leaning governments usually invest more in the social sector. So we have some homegrown examples. But to me, the argument that these countries did well because they were led by women seems a little bit superficial. I think there's more to it. I think the fact that these countries ended up with strong female leadership says something about the kind of societies they are. So the way our society is set up, if a society is set up in a way that it is gives space to a number of people from different backgrounds, whether it's women, people from different racial backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, I think that's the kind of society that ends up producing good leaders and maybe also ends up producing more women leaders more frequently.
Marine, do you have any view on this? Maybe a parochial view?
Yes, definitely. Just yesterday, we had a very healthy panel discussion on this topic, women in leadership spaces. It was generated inside the Parliament, and I think I would love to talk about it. And I would love to say that as your statement, I think the first name that came into my mind was of Jacinda Ardern. And yes, she is a female prime minister, and New Zealand has been very actively and very nicely managing this whole COVID-19 situation. And other than that, talking about Pakistan, I think I would like to name Dr. Nausheen Hamid over here. She is the Parliamentary Secretary for Health, and she's been very active since day one. She presented she's also a sub-convener of SDG 3 of our task force, and she's been handling all the COVID-19 related situation very nicely. And I still think that being a woman, she presented, and she's been doing a very good job. Other than that, I think women in leadership spaces and women as being leaders do really a good job. And given the opportunity and giving the right circumstances and healthy spaces, I think women can perform. And I think this will be it. I truly and fully endorse your statement when it comes to women in leadership spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned over the years, that to every complex problem, there may be a simple answer or a simple solution. More often than not, it can be wrong. So one has to also recognize the caveat that the program that all of you have talked about, the Benazir Income Support Program, has also had female leadership in the past. In fact, one of them is under investigation right now. So it's not just the gender, it's also what you bring to the position in terms of understanding and in terms of not only empathy, but also technical skills on the basis of which you are able to deliver. So I think it's extremely important, yes, for us to ensure that we have people at the helm of affairs who recognize the pain that you have with gender inequity and the barriers that are put up in terms of every girl achieving her absolute birthright to excel and to reach a certain level of education, development, well-being. But you can't just get that on the basis of wishful thinking. You have to bring some skills and some obviously strong management attributes to it as well. There's a question that I have been parking in the parking lot here that I like to come back to, and that's the issue of how mainstreamed are questions of equity within our political system. As you know, the SDGs, what a great advance over the MDGs, because the MDGs never spoke about inequities. In fact, the MDGs buried a lot of the disparities within goal 1 of just poverty alleviation, and was achieved years before the other goals were ever achieved without changing anything on the ground. So now we have a gender equality goal. We also have inequities built within some of the goal 3. So there is all of that. Yet, I find it very troubling, and Abid, I'm asking you because you have the historical perspective, that none of our political parties, mainstream political parties, actually have that language in their manifestos or in their programs. I mean, there is talk about justice and, you know, reaching the poor, but an explicit mention of reducing disparities isn't there. And I'll give you one example why this is important. So Jeff Sachs talked about Donald Trump. He gave out $1.5 trillion in the stimulus plan, and 60% plus of that went to making the rich corporations and the rich single owners of those corporations richer. So if anything, that stimulus plan worsened inequities in North America, and we see that right now. So Abid, why has, since Roti Kapda Makan and, you know, reaching the poor, disappeared from our political lexicon?
I think, of course, the major structural problem is that democracy is never a functional democracy in Pakistan. So we always have hybrid models of democracy. And when I say functional democracy, that means democracy within the political parties who are actually striving for this system. So if we don't have a functional democracy in the political parties who happen to be the representative of people of Pakistan, who happen to raise voice towards a more equitable and a more social justice based society, then of course equity would become a mere dream or a wish list. Second thing that I can say is the way the student unions were banned in Pakistan back in 1980s. I think that actually somehow stopped any chances of leadership coming from grassroots level to the mainstream parties. I can name names who were student leaders, student union leaders in all political parties, be they were in opposition or in trade benches, but those were the people who actually hailed from grassroots levels, and they were able to then talk about all those inequalities, or at least they were able to pressurize their leaders, even if Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who gave us the slogan Roti Kapda Makan, was not from the grassroots level, but the people around him, I think those were a great force so that they could pursue him and compel him to give this sort of slogan and follow it in letter and spirit. But now this whole political education that started from student unions, that started from labor unions, that started from other people's movement, not only in education institutes, but other institutes, those have got vanished. And one of the result of this is that it has given rise to a society where we can't agree to disagree in an amicable manner. Where very often having ideological or political difference, it becomes a crime. And within that sort of society, social justice and equality, it is much more required and needed, but then it becomes a difficult task to achieve. But then I'm very optimistic from our youth. They are much more empowered than I am or than you were because of their grip on social media. Now all of them, they can hold us accountable for any small mistake. They can appreciate us for any small thing. They can atomize this whole revolution, and this sort of empowerment, I think that is where the ray of hope is, and they can actually work towards a more equitable society. And of course, we are their followers.
Well, so true, and absolutely, and I concur with a lot of that. There is a lot of hope, but I do agree with you that our factories, our production factories of political thought have been stifled since the 80s, and it's time to bring a lot of the students into the mainstream of politics, not therefore leading the road, the whole plane open to only feudals and those who are the landed privileged. So Wafa, I want to come to you with the same question, but in a slightly different flavor. So how do we practically, in terms of engaging our youth with Sustainable Development Goals principles, ensure that our curricula, both our undergraduate and our postgraduate curricula, include some of this language as well as some of this debate?
Right. So I think that's a very good point of, bringing these issues into young people's consciousness at a very foundational level by including these in curricula. And one of the opportunities is that the government is currently working on a uniform national curriculum, and that's one framework within which some of these issues, which are, essentially existential for us as a country and as a planet, of course, can be incorporated. So I think that's a great opportunity for including some of these things. I think our curricula are little, especially when we talk about the public sector. I think private sector schools tend to have different curricula, but then they cater to a smaller population. I think our public sector curricula, in terms of what kind of issues our modern societies, 21st century societies face, is a little outdated. But I think we're now, while we are reviewing our curricula, this is an opportunity to revamp the whole thing and look at it from a 21st century perspective.
Fantastic. Mehreen, I want to ask you as to how do we do this in terms of the education of our politicians? Not everybody who comes into Parliament is well aware and well versed in these issues, because as we've discussed, they're not part of our political debate. So what is happening within the Parliament of self-education of our parliamentarians on the context and principles of SDGs?
All right, so I would like to state that I am the development associate at this secretariat, the SDGs Secretariat. This secretariat is wholly dedicated to the SDGs agenda. What we do is we provide technical assistance, technical information, and authentic data regarding SDGs for informed policy making, for oversight, for evidence-based legislation. And what we do is we archive all the business that is being presented in the House related to SDGs. And other than that, what we do is we promote the engagements of our parliamentarians with the development partners, with think tanks, with experts. SDPI is also our supporter, our partner with SGPI is also a partner with the SDG Secretariat and the task force. And this is how we host regular meetings, we host regular consultation sessions with our parliamentarians, and we host such consultation sessions not just with our task force, but with all the MPs, with the standing committees. I think standing committees also play a very vital role in providing an SDG lens to the business of the House. And this is how the SDG Secretariat aims to provide technical assistance, technical knowledge, and give authentic and grassroots level ideas and and contributes to the informed policy making inside the House.
Well, thank you so much for those reflections. I think this has been a fantastic session, and I'd like to bring it to a close with some summary thoughts. Professor Sachs left us with a lot of food for thought. He, in particular, talked about the role of the private sector that he mentioned in the context of Pakistan and the Reko affair. And I know that he feels very strongly about it. He has written, in fact, he's the only international global economist who has actually written about the so-called, and he called it the mugging. He said the Pakistan had been mugged by these bandits from the World Bank arbitration panel. So I know that he feels very strongly about it. But in the context, we started off with a fundamental question. We started off with a question asking ourselves, if COVID-19 and the crisis that we faced over the last 1 year since the declaration of the pandemic on March 11 has derailed or let's say finished the SDG agenda for Pakistan and other low and middle income countries. And I think what we have heard from many of our panelists, and notably from our invited speakers, is that it is probably not the case, that there have been silver linings and there has been a positive recognition of some of the issues that COVID-19 uncovered. And they also food for thought. I attribute some of the awareness on undernutrition in women and children in Pakistan to the 2010 floods. It was at the time of the 2010 floods when people came out of our Kacha areas and all of the media suddenly recognized that they were seeing in front of them levels of malnutrition in children and women that they had not witnessed in regular times. And it's because these poor people who are always there were just not visible to the public eye until a catastrophe or a calamity brought them out on the streets. And that's why we saw a number of things happen after that, and they still continue to this date with incomplete implementation, but they are there on the national policy horizon. Similarly, I think COVID-19 brought forward the notion that not only are the poor most likely to suffer the consequences of the illness, as they have in North America. The vast majority of the people who have been victims of severe disease, hospitalization, and deaths have belonged to ethnic minorities, have belonged to people who are below the poverty line, who just don't have the luxury or the option of working from home and have to be the public face of what they do. In the United Kingdom, the disproportionate number of deaths in minorities representing Black populations, Asians, and other ethnic minorities has been enormous. And some people have shrugged it off, but others have picked up upon it to say this is a lesson in terms of how you make sure that your social policies and your development thinking mainstream some of these issues into your development agenda. So remember that the Sustainable Development Goals were coined as a global equity agenda. They were coined in terms of the interconnectedness of things to make sure that you don't think of health as something in isolation of the needs for education, the needs for environmental health, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the need for appropriate nutrition and food security, and importantly, the need for gender equality and gender parity in many of the things that we do. So these are things that COVID-19 has only made very clear to us that are important, not only in emergency times, but also in times of relative calm and peace. And my final words on this, colleagues, which have not been explicitly articulated during the course of today, is that there can be no peace without sustainable development. And in Pakistan in particular, as Dr. Abid Suhairi has articulated several times, that some of our existential crises that are going to come with climate change and environmental stresses are going to come from lack of investments in those sectors with greater propensity for disasters and also potentially water wars on the basis of water sharing between states, if not between provinces. So these are national security issues that all of us have to be aware of, and nobody's going to come and sort them out from the World Bank or the United Nations. We would have to find solutions ourselves, and they have to be solutions which are tangible and doable. So ladies and gentlemen, with a few minutes remaining, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance. And I'd like to in particular thank all the panelists and our honorable chief guest who had to leave a little early for their participation in this. The Aga Khan University Institute for Global Health and Development has been undertaking these educational and advocacy related activities over the last 1 year. We will continue to do so, but on sustainable development goals, I'd like to just highlight a few things that we want to do as the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Hub in Pakistan. Our role is to bring people together and also to bring the academic centers, the university departments who are interested in this, both individual faculty members and programs, to give them a platform where they can work together. So I would encourage people on this, in this particular webinar, to stay in touch and to write to us in terms of how you would like to engage and how we could potentially work together. I deliberately chose to invite Dr. Abid Suhairi, who's a regional and a national leader in this discipline, and I'd like to offer an opportunity for collaboration with Sustainable Development Policy Institute. We don't have the reach that you do have as SDPI, Suhairi Saab, and while we have a focus on health and health-related sustainable development goals, maybe when we join hands and also extend our hands to the parliamentarians who are now beginning to think about this, I think we could really do a lot more than we can otherwise. My final words on this are that we have an opportunity with a new Senate coming in, with a number of fresh faces and a lot of young faces. So particularly, I was very thrilled to see some of the names that have come in. And although these are politically strained times, there is an opportunity for us to do a lot more. And maybe we could develop a joint program in terms of advocacy and education of our parliamentarians on some of these issues. So ladies and gentlemen, with those closing remarks, I'd like to thank all of you for your attendance, and please stay in touch. And once again, thank you very much to our fantastic young panelists and to Abid Suhairi, who's always young, but also very distinguished. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Bhutta sir.
Thank you.
SDPI is already a member of SDS, and we will be happy to work with you and collaborate with you.
Well, we'll develop something together. Thank you. Thank you, Abid Saab. Thank you very
so
much, Marine. Thank you, Wafa.
Thank you.
And look forward to staying in touch.
Definitely, sir. Thank you so much.